are here to talk about what's new in Spring Boot 2.6. Again, my name is Dan Vega. I'll tell you a little bit about me in a second. I'm a Spring developer advocate for VMware. As of tomorrow, I am 1 month in, so happy 1 month to me. As far as chat and comments go, questions, please feel free to ask questions. If they're relevant to kind of what we're talking about, I'll try to get to those as we are talking about them. If they're a little bit more contrived, a little bit more in length, maybe we could talk about them towards the end. So I'll keep my eye on the chat, but as I'm kind of in the middle of, ranting, I may not see it. So just bear with me. Again, we can try to get to questions during and at the end. So a little bit about me. I am a husband and a father. There is my beautiful wife, Jen, my 2 daughters, Isabella and Juliana. I've been a software developer for over 20 years now. And like I said, just recently took up Spring Developer Advocate. I've been a huge fan of Spring for a long, long time. So this was really kind of a culmination of many years of different roles, anywhere from a web developer to a software engineer to a principal architect. I've done some curriculum development for boot camp, a kind of myriad of roles that kind of brought me here. One of the things I love to do is create content. So if you head over to danvega.dev, you can find out a lot more about me. I'm a blogger. Well, I'm a part-time blogger now. I have more focus on video, but I do have some articles over there. I'm a YouTuber, course creator, and I'm a Clevelander. But since I'm at the San Francisco Java user group tonight, fun little fact about me, about 20 years ago, a aspiring techie joined a startup out in San Francisco called 5.9, which you may or may not have heard of. At the time we were in Emeryville, I was living on the border of Oakland and Berkeley. So I spent a lot of time in Berkeley 20 years ago, even though I didn't go to college there. Really enjoyed my time in San Francisco, miss it. I've been back a few times, but always want to get back, and we'll hopefully I will be back this year for Spring 1. So I'm excited to be there.
Nice. Hopefully see you there.
Yeah, for sure. So a little bit of an agenda. When you're looking at the release notes for any new version of Spring Boot, it's usually broken down into 2 sections: upgrading from Spring Boot, the previous version, and what's new and noteworthy. One of the things that I've kind of found out when I was preparing for this talk was that in the past, I've kind of looked at release notes as more of a like, let me just scan through there and see what's new and see if I care about anything, and maybe pick out 1 or 2 things and go, oh, those things are cool. But some of those things I don't understand. And I wish I would have paid more attention to them in the past, because like I said, preparing for this talk, if you really take the time to understand, some of the motivations for the new features or just anything kind of going into that release, you'll get a really good understanding of Spring and Spring Boot. And I think, 3 of my favorite resources to get up and running with Spring now are the docs, obviously, the quick start guides that you can go through, and the release notes. If you really pay attention to the release notes, you can learn a lot. So we're going to go through upgrading from Spring Boot 2.5. We'll actually talk a little bit about some of the features that came from 2.4. And we'll talk about, if you just blindly upgrade your application to 2.6, what are some of the things that you may run into, some things that may prevent you from upgrading. So we want to talk about those. And then we'll talk about new and noteworthy stuff. So I'm not going to read through all the things on the screen here. You can see them, but these are kind of the things that we're going to go through. And again, these are in the release notes, but I kind of like this going through and looking at code examples of each of these as we go through. So let's talk about upgrading from Spring Boot 2.5. So deprecations, I actually didn't know this is how deprecations worked until I was going through this, but deprecations, any classes, methods, and properties that were deprecated in Spring Boot 2.4 have been removed in this release. So this is how deprecations work. 2 versions later, they're going to be removed. So if you were to jump into the docs and look at the 2.4.0 API, there's a section in there for deprecations, and you can pull up all of those. And right there, anything that was in 2.4.0 has now been, well, anything that was been deprecated for removal has now been removed. So those are the first things that you really want to take a look at before upgrading to a new version. Speaking of releases, it's a good time to remind you that we release a new version of Spring Boot every 6 months or so. We release, this is kind of like a major version. So 2.6 was released in November. We release a new patch version every month or so. We have 2.6.4, which is coming out tomorrow. And this is a good time to remind you that we've moved away from the .release suffix. So before 2.4, everything kind of had that .release in it. So it was like 2.3.7 .release. We've dropped that release now. And so everything is just, as you see, 2.6.4. You can also jump into GitHub and go in the Spring projects and look at things like milestones and tags and see what releases are out there in case you're not sure, what are the available releases and what are the available upcoming releases. There's also this really great calendar that I'm going to jump over to. Just make sure we can see that. This is public calendar at calendar.spring.io. And this will just kind of give you an idea of what's being released all the time. So here we are on the 23rd. And you can see that that 2.6.4 for Spring Boot is being released tomorrow. So you can just kind of flip through here and take a look at the release calendar. So that's a kind of handy thing to take a look at. So that's really all I had to talk about when it comes to slides as far as upgrading to 2.5. And what I want to do now is really go through some code. So I do have a GitHub repo here, github.com/danvega, what's new in Spring Boot 2.6. And here you'll find the few slides that I have, I've exported to a PDF. And then there's a few different branches on here. So the first branch that, the first kind of iteration that we're going to go through is creating a 2.5.9 project so that we can then go ahead and upgrade it to 2.6.3 and take a look at some of those gotchas that we're going to run into. So let's go ahead and close this project. And we'll create a new one. Again, you could do this from start.spring.io. If you're new to Spring Boot, that website will allow you to create a new Bootstrap, a new Spring Boot project. I'm a big IntelliJ fan, so I'm going to do it right here in IntelliJ. This is the ultimate version, but again, if you're using the community version, that's fine. Just run it from start.spring.io and unzip it and open it up in IntelliJ. So we're going to call this, let's call this Blogger, and we'll put this in Spring Boot. I'm just kind of creating a trivial application here that will represent maybe a blogging system. And again, we're going to start with 2.5.9. So we're going to select that from the version. And we're going to have a couple dependencies here. We're going to have web, and we're going to have the actuator. And that's all there is to it. We'll go ahead and click finish. Scanning questions as we go. One thing I like to do every time I create a new application is just go ahead and run it. Make sure everything is working before we get started. And everything looks like it is. So the first thing I want to talk about is circular references. And to do so, I'm going to create a new package here, and we'll call this service. And I'm going to create a new service here, and we'll call this our post service. And I'm also going to create a new service called comment service. So again, just trivial examples here, just kind of highlighting a couple of things. So let me see if I can move that up. That helps. So here in our post service, again, this is in our 2.5.9 application. we may have a dependency on the comment service, right? So we might write something like private final comment service. We may create a constructor that takes that, and that's how we can get an instance of the comment service here in our post service. Now, this is all minus Spring right now. We haven't annotated this with at service or at components. We're not bringing Spring into the equation yet. And I'm doing so on purpose. I kind of want to talk about this. So in the comment service, I may need a post service. And actually, let's go ahead and make that final. We'll call this post service, and we'll need a constructor. And the reason I want to do this is just to highlight a circular dependency. So our post service is relying on a comment service to be injected, and a comment service is relying on a post service to be injected. So if we take Spring out of the equation, which we have, again, we haven't annotated these services with anything. Think about trying to do this in the regular world, right? So I may create a post service, and I would call it new post service, and that's going to take a comment service. So I need a comment service in there. Well, I could fix that. I can create a comment service, call it comment service, and now I can pass that in here. So that satisfies that one, but I can't really do this, right? Like that is not going to allow me to do that. And so again, this is kind of just highlighting what a circular dependency is outside of Spring. So when you bring Spring into the equation, it's going to do the same thing. It doesn't know how to handle that situation. So if we come in here and we say that this is a service and the comment service is a service, now we've told Spring that we want you to handle this for us. So at startup, it's going to try and create an instance of comment service and inject a post service, and vice versa. It's going to try to create an instance of the post service and inject the comment service. So if we go ahead and try to run this now, and again, if you see some of these gray suggestions that are coming up, I'm using this plugin called GitHub Copilot. It does a lot of AI thinking for me, which is really good during the day, but during presentations, it can be a distraction sometimes, but it actually helps. So I keep it on. Okay, so we tried to run this and it says, hey, the dependencies of these beans, hey, these are, this is a secular dependency here. Like this one is dependent on this one and this one's dependent on that one. So you can't really do that. So again, before we even upgrade, there are some ways that we can resolve this. One of the ways is we can come in here and mark this with that lazy, and this would kind of fix it. There are some pros and cons to everything. This actually creates a proxy, but it does solve the problem, and we can go ahead and start this, and it would start fine. Another thing we could do is back in like this scenario. If we were doing this without Spring, we could do something like post service. If we had like a setter here, we could do something like post service dot set comment service, right? So again, just think of this like you would in a normal Java application, and you'll start to think exactly how Spring is working. So what I want to show you here is as we upgrade to 2.6.3, we're going to run into an application, or we're going to run into a problem. And one of the problems here is we don't always see this. What we see in a lot of applications is this, right? And, oops. And we'll see this. So in this case, we have auto wired in final. So we're using field injection here, and even IntelliJ is probably going to tell us, yep, field injection is not recommended. But in 2.5.9, this will work because it's not using constructor injection. After an instance of that's created, it will use reflection and inject an instance of that. So I want to hold there we'll talk about more about why constructor injection is preferred and some things that we can do to fix this issue when we upgrade to 2.6.3, which is not going to allow this. But like I said, we're going to make our way through this kind of application that we're building to then upgrade. So I want to talk about something else, and that is we're going to create a new package here, and we're going to call this controller. And in here, I'm going to create a new Java class, and I'm going to call this a post controller. And we'll mark this with @rest controller. And inside of here, we're going to create a new path mapping. We'll use a get mapping, and we'll say that this is going to be located at post/name/name. And what we want this to return is nothing. And this is a find post by author. Now you notice we have two names there. One could be a surname, one could be a first name. But in this case, all this method wanted was a single name. So this could be path variable string name. And all we're going to do is print out the name and the name. So this actually works in 2.5.9. So if we go ahead and run this, this is going to work. And if we want to test this out, we can use, we can go to the browser and test this out if we want, and go to localhost 8080/post/name. We can also, if you're an IntelliJ user, I like to use the HTTP client right here in here. So I can say, oh, we have one from a test I was doing. So /post/last name and first name. And if I go ahead and run this and look at our console, it's just going to say name is Dan. And what's happening there is that the last one wins out. So there's two parameters in our path there. And the way this works in 2.5.9 and before is that we have a certain strategy that we use to match paths. And that is the ANT path matcher. And we'll look as we upgrade to 2.6.3 that we kind of switch the default path matcher to something else that is not as lenient as the ANT one is here. So again, just kind of building some things out, and we're going to upgrade all of these at once. Next thing I want to look at is if I go into resources and go to application.properties, I could do something like spring.application.name. And we'll just call this my Blogger app. And then what I'm going to do is drop in a few keys. And this is the Actuator env info contributor. So there's a class in Spring called the info contributor. And this is a functional interface, and it allows us to go ahead and tack on information to the info endpoint. So you can imagine a scenario. I've been in large organizations where there are, tons and tons of microservices, and maybe you wanted to expose some information on that microservice to another team. So if they're able to hit your Actuator endpoints, this is one of the ones that you might want to expose. So actually, let's go ahead and management. Oops. Let's go ahead and say, I want to open up all of those. And if we were to go ahead and rerun this, what I want to do is hop over to the browser and take a look at the Actuator. And if we look at the info endpoint, you can see that we have some information in there about our app. So again, this could be useful. You can really tack on anything you want to this. We could even come in here and say, if we go up to edit run configurations, we could come in here into our environment, and in our program arguments, we could say department. Maybe we could have our favorite emoji here. This is one I use all the time. And if we go ahead and rerun this, you can see that that shows up there. So that this info environment, the env info contributor, it's basically taking things from any property source that contribute to configuration. So whether it's command line arguments or our application.properties source here, it's combining all those and displaying those for us. So this is, again, pre 2.6. This is something that we're able to do. We'll take a look at kind of what's changed with that in 2.6 in a little bit. Something else I want to look at from 2.4, if you weren't aware. So first off, if you weren't aware, the Spring application.run is a little bit of a shortcut for something else, because most of the time this is all you need to do. But if you need to change the Spring application, if you need to add to it or change some things that are going on, you can actually use the long version. So this is basically saying new Spring application. And it looks something like that. So you create a new instance of Spring application with the class, and then you call the run method. We're not going to call that just yet. What we're going to do is create a local variable, and we're going to add to this. So Spring, let's do that. Spring application dot set application startup. So again, this is from 2.4. In 2.4, we added a new interface and 2 implementations of it. And the idea behind this interface, so this is the application startup interface. The idea behind this is that if you've ever tried to profile a Spring application before, you might find that it's quite difficult. Because you end up in the same kind of create bean method a lot, it's hard to tell where the actual problem is. So this interface allows us to get much more detailed about the application as it starts. Now, there's only a single method here, start, but this is a series of startup steps. So as I said before, there are actually 2 implementations of this, the flight recorder application startup, which you can use, or the buffering application startup. So you pass in, a capacity here. I'm just going to put something in that's very big. And then we can call Spring application.run and pass in our args. So now we go ahead and restart this application. Everything looks okay. If we go back to our actuator, there's actually a new endpoint down here called startup. And so again, if you don't configure some type of application startup, you won't see this endpoint. But if you do, this endpoint is here. There's a bunch of metrics on this endpoint. I won't, well, let's see. So if we jump down in here, there's a spring.boot.application.running. So if we look, there is a step for this spring.boot.application.running. This will change in 2.6.3, which we'll take a look at. But I kind of wanted to just make you aware of that this was here, because a lot of folks don't know that you can do this. And again, this comes in very handy if you start trying to get some more information about what's going on in your application. So that's that. Let me talk about one more, and then we'll go ahead and upgrade our application. So I'm going to create a new package here, and we'll call this model. And in the model, I'm going to create a new Java class called author properties. And in author properties is going to be a configuration properties with the prefix of blogger.author. And it's just a way for us to set some author properties in our application. Now, of course, the Spring Boot configuration annotation processor is not defined. If you click that, it just opens you to the documentation and basically tells you, hey, here's the Maven dependency or the Grado dependency that you need to put in your application. And I'm going to go ahead and reload those settings here in Maven. And this should no longer be yelling at us. Now, this is going to yell at us still because we have not on our main application said that we want to enable that. So we want to, let me get rid of this. Sorry. Want to enable configuration properties, and we'll pass in our author properties here just to limit it to that. Okay, so now at this point, everything should be okay. So we'll probably want something like a string of first name, a last name, and a email address. And we can come in here and say, first name of the author. All right, and then we need getters and setters. All right, and this is what a normal property class looks like. So now with this in here, we can go over to our application.properties, and we may set some info about the author of whoever is in this blogging application. So we can say blogger dot, let's see, let's generate that metadata that is not there. So we need to build that. So blogger dot author dot first name is Dan. Blogger dot last name is Vega. In our email. So this is one way of doing it, right? But if you notice, this author properties is a little bit verbose. There's kind of a lot going on here just to like expose some properties in our application, right? So if you noticed over here on when we created our application, we decided to use Java 17. So in Java 16 and later, we can go ahead and take advantage of something like records. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove all that noise, and we're going to turn this into a record. And we need to say string first name, string last name, and string email. Okay, so we got rid of all that stuff. Some things are still going to yell at us if we try and run this application though. And that's because parameter 0 of constructor in that author properties required a bean of type string that could not be found. So what's going on here is if we take a look at that class, if you're kind of new to records, if we look at the model of what that author properties looks like, it creates an immutable class for us, right? Or it's a record, but it is immutable. So this means that to create this type, you need to pass in your parameters into the constructor. And then you can call the getters if you need that information, but there is no setters. And that's what's going on is our configuration properties are trying to call a setter and there is no setter. So you can correct this by using an annotation here, just as it says down here in the help context. We can use constructor binding. So if we look at that, this is an annotation that can be used to indicate that configuration properties should be bound using constructor arguments rather than colon setters. So with that in place, we can go ahead and run this. And everything works. But as we'll see when we upgrade our application to 2.6.3, we can kind of clean this up even more. Okay, so that is the gist of our 2.5.9 application. Is just checking questions here. Any questions? Any questions on that particular application that we built so far? All right, I'm going to keep going. So what we are going to do is we're going to upgrade this application. So let's go into our POM. We're going to upgrade this from 2.5.9 to 2.6.3. That is the latest version. I'm going to save that and reload our Maven changes. And then first thing I'm gonna do is just try and run this, and we'll see what kind of things yell at us. And there are gonna be some things yelling at us, or this wouldn't be that fun. Okay, so remember back in our old app, we moved away from constructor injection and we used these field injections, and it worked fine in our previous application. Well, now it's not working fine. Now Spring Boot has really picked up on this and said, okay, I see what you're trying to do here. This is a circular reference. We need to try and find a way around this. We need to not do this. So this is just encouraging us to move away from these circular references and find a better way to do this. Now, let's say that you're upgrading this application and there's just like so much to do to upgrade this, and you can't go through and deal with this right now. So, all right, we have an escape hatch for that. So if you want to leave that code in place without changing it and still upgrade, you can. There's a spring.main.allow circular references equal to true. And we can go ahead and run this now and it'll work. This is a different error that we'll come back to. But at the same time, again, I still don't like using this. If we have the opportunity to fix some of this, we should. So this is where I'll go kind of into, again, you'll hear this a lot from the Spring team. It's noted in the docs a couple times. You'll hear from people, try to use constructor injection wherever possible. And we say this, and a lot of the times people, people's first response is, why? This is so much easier. Like I can just throw auto-wired on a field. But let's take a look at a couple things. I want to jump into the documentation real quick. Let me find my link. Just wanted to see if here is. Okay, so there is a section in here for constructor-based or setter-based DI. And one of the things I really like to highlight in here is constructor injection, as it lets you, so the Spring team generally advocates for constructor injection as it lets you implement application components as immutable objects and ensures that required dependencies are not null. So that for me is kind of the key. And so let's talk about this. So remember, we had to remove the keyword final from this from before because this can't be final, right? We want it to be final though. We want it to be immutable. We don't want it to be changed later. The comment service, once it's created, that should be it. It should not be able to be changed later. The other thing I have a problem with here is that we have marked this as private. If we're following the conventions, of the language, marking a field as private means that nobody outside this class should be able to access it. But yet somehow at runtime, we've injected this, comment service into this field. And I'm sure most of you know that is done through reflection. So, this comes into another problem that if you want to go ahead and let's say comment service had database access and you were trying to create a unit test of just your post service, it's really hard to mock out comment service now. And if you want someone to get an instance of comment service into your class, now they need to understand how reflection works and create, inject that instance into the class. So there are a bunch of things going on here that just kind of smell, they have bad smells to them, if you will. Anytime you're like, I don't know if this is the right thing to do, it's probably not the right thing to do. So with that out of the way, I'm going to move to a constructor injection. So I'm going to say, okay, how can we do this? Well, remember, we're gonna have that same problem that we had before, that if we make this final and we have constructor injection on both sides, then we're gonna have an issue here, right? So what I'm gonna do is, in this case, because constructor injection on both sides of a circular reference are gonna cause an issue, now I can move to kind of the next preferred method, which is setter injection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a public void set comment service that's going to take in a comment service. This dot comment service is equal to comment service. And what we'll do is say this is auto wired. And now this can no longer be final. But I think this is going to go ahead and solve our issue. Circular reference is still discouraged. Private comment service. Stop comment service equals that. All right, I don't know why that is causing an issue. That should not cause an issue. So let's just get rid of it for a second. And come back here, and I'm just going to fix this. I have it fixed in the final version. I don't know why that is not working. We're just going to add an at lazy, and that will fix up that issue. Again, the only downside to this is it actually does create a proxy of that, and we're on to a different error. I do stray final, Alex says. Stray away from final or stay final? Then is there a way we can avoid setters for common? Oh, I had stray final. Ah, okay. Well, that's probably why. Is there a way we can avoid setters for comment service? Is there a way we can avoid setters? So again, no, it's the comment service has, if we go, remember, if we go back to the example that I showed before we even brought Spring into the picture, you can't have both except each other in the constructor, right? There's just no way to do that, even outside of Spring. So that's why if you can create one, create the other, and then set that comment service in the post service, that would work. There is line 12. No, you still have to set this here. Because again, this is basically like this. This is implicit. Since Spring 5.4.3 or whatever, if there's only a single constructor, then Spring is just gonna, hey, you probably need the argument here auto wired in for you. So this is gonna get auto wired in, and then you're saying, hey, the comment service in our post service is the one that is getting passed in here. You removed all the code. Are you going to bring it back? I removed, all I removed was the setter, but yeah, we can try that again. So what this is. Right, let's try that. Yeah, that I again, I don't know why that's happening. What's in the comment service now? Right. I mean, this should. All right, so now we should say this is auto wired, and let's try and run it. Yeah, something is going on because this should work. So we're just going to fix this real quick to get moving. Okay, so again, that lazy annotation would have been fine as well. The joys of live demos. So again, the final version in GitHub has that working just how it should. So I'm not sure what's going on. So the next thing that we're going to look at here is this invalid mapping. Remember, we talked about this in our post controller. We had this /post/name. This is no longer going to work. And that's because, as we talked about earlier, that we moved from the ant path matcher to a path pattern parser. And so if you're using anything like controllers, mappings and controllers, if you're using things like Spring Security, where you're matching a path, these are things that you're going to want to look out for. The ant path matcher was much more lenient. The path pattern parser is much more strict. Now, to me, in this case, like this is just a bug anyway. Like this shouldn't be like this. But in any sense, it allowed it. 2.6.3, it will not allow it. Just as we did before with circular reference, we could go ahead and add a property here to say, hey, let's change that default matching strategy back to the ant path matcher, and that would fix this. But in this case, I only have one instance of it, and I'd rather just go ahead and fix it. And so I might do something like last name, first name, and then in this case, this would be, last name, path variable, string, first name. And then here, would say name, something like that. All right, and then if we run this, that error should go away, and we're looking better. Now, the next one I want to look at, though, is the Actuator environment info contributor. So if you remember, if we went to the Actuator and we went over to info, we had all this information on the info Actuator and endpoint, and we don't have any of that now. And so the reason for that is because we've made a change here in 2.6. And what we made a change was we felt like it was potentially a security risk. If we have anything that starts with info from any property source, you saw me use a application.properties file, you saw me put something on the command line arguments. So we felt like, info from any property source ending up on your Actuator endpoint could be a potential security risk. So what we've decided to do is make that an opt-in in Spring Boot. So those properties are still going to work. The only thing we need to do is we need to kind of update this and allow it. So we're just going to say management.info.env.enabled, and we'll set this to true. Whoops. And so if we rerun this and come back over here, there's our information back. So the other change that I just wanted to quickly mention was on that startup endpoint, we looked for a spring.boot.application.running property before. That's now been changed to spring.boot.application.ready. So just a quick change in the name of the particular event that is happening. Again, if you're using the flight recorder application startup or the buffering application startup, one of the two implementations we have of that interface, you'll want to make sure that you note that change. And so finally, on our upgrade path to 2.6.3, one more thing I want to take a look at is we created this author properties And we talked through why we created this, how we had to add this constructor binding. Well, with records, this is really just redundant, right? Like we know this, like the only way to create a new record is through constructor bindings. So in 2.6.3, we can just go ahead and remove this. Let's clean up our import. And if we run this again, there should be no problems. Oh, cool. Thanks, Alex. I'll take a look at that. I thought I had that fixed up. Records are awesome. They are. They are just cutting down on some of the verbosity that Java sometimes gets a bad rap for. And yeah, I'm enjoying using them whenever I can, wherever I can. So I find a lot more uses for them, even for something like this, for just setting configuration properties. They're great. Okay, so that is kind of our upgrade path. Let's take a look at time. We are getting close, but we have a few more things to take a look at. All right, so new and noteworthy. First thing you want to look at when you're looking at the release notes is pay attention to the dependency upgrades. So there's a section for Spring projects. Here are the Spring projects that are updated. So now you get all the new goodness and things like Spring Security 5.6, Spring Session, Spring Data 2021.1. And if you're not aware, you'll see some of the different Spring projects follow a different release versioning number. And so like Spring Data and Spring Session are using the calendar years. So that version is 2021.1, as opposed to something like Spring Security that uses 5.6. Some of the highlights on the third-party dependencies, we have Apache Kafka 3.0, Hibernate is at 5.6, JUnit Jupyter is up to 5.8, and one of the things on my list this year is definitely to get more into all the cool features in JUnit 5. I feel like I'm way behind on JUnit 5. I'm still like stuck in my head on 4, mainly because of things dependencies I've had to deal with in the past, but it's nice to see JUnit Jupyter 5.8 here. Things like Makito 4.0, Micrometer 1.8, Kotlin 1.6, newest version of Postgres 42.3, and so on. So a whole bunch of great dependency upgrades here in 2.6. Just a small server session properties. If you're using Webflux, it was underneath the spring.webflux.session and anything else under there. That has moved to server.reactive.session. And that's really just to align with the Spring MVC properties. So those are under, a similar server.web.session. If you want to, on the build info, it's now possible to exclude specific properties from being added to the build.info. And you can do this in both Maven and Gradle. So just a quick way to do that. So in this case, we're saying, hey, we don't want the version number tacked on. So get rid of that. So minor typo. Thanks, Peter. And that's what I wanted to show there. We'll jump in and actually take a look at some code as far as what's new. So the first thing I want to talk about is SameSite cookie attribute. So I'm going to open up some documentation really quick, just so we can take a look at that. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there is an attribute on a cookie called SameSite, and there are 3 values for it: lax, strict, and none. And the reason the reason we're taking a look at this now is because there's always been these values, but it's the way the browsers are now defaulting it to something called lax. And so I will, these links should be in the PDF slides, I think. And if not, they're I'll make sure I get these somewhere. But if you want to kind of learn more about what what the SameSite attribute is for, I'll leave some documentation. At a high level, you can think of it as, there are these things called first-party cookies by default. and again, a first party cookie is if I'm on danvega.dev and I have a cookie there for that domain, or I'm sending a link to that same domain. So same, that's a first party cookie. If I have a third party cookie, this could be something that is cross site. Maybe I'm loading some Google Analytics. Maybe I'm embedding a YouTube in an iframe, right? Those are third party cookies. And so the browsers have changed their default and really a way to go ahead and help us prevent some more CSRF attacks. And so let's take a look at what's happening here in this application. So what I'm going to do is create a Java controller. We'll call this session controller. We're going to make this a controller. And I think in the interest of time, go ahead and plop some code in here and take a look at it. So I have a private static final string name. So this is just an attribute. So I have a home mapping. So when we go ahead and rerun this application and visit home, we're going to get this method called set, and it's going to accept a session and a response. I actually don't know. Yeah, so we're getting the session and the response. So in the session, we're just going to try and get an attribute. We're trying to get this attribute called my attribute. If it's null, we're just going to set that value to whatever the instant.now is. And we're going to set that session attribute to that value. So this right off the bat is going to cause us to get a cookie, the JSession ID cookie from the servlet. And then what we're going to do is, actually, I want to go ahead and just stop this for now. And we're going to return that value. So don't mind the cookie yet. Let's just take a look at what's going on here. And so if I rerun this and I come back to home, there's our time. Now, if I inspect this and I take a look at our application and I take a look at our cookies, this is probably from before, this is what's happening right now. So we have this JSession ID. You'll see this column over here for SameSite. So the SameSite right now is not set to anything. And I think what's really tripped up a lot of people is that instead of defaulting it to lax is the default, but it actually just doesn't say lax in here. So the default will be lax, but it doesn't say that in here. So a lot of applications may have worked on a default on the behavior of what defaulted before, which was basically none, which did allow you to kind of click through and send a cookie off to a third party. But again, we're trying to kind of move away from that to prevent some of these CSRF attacks. So the other thing I want to do here is we're going to create a new cookie. So we're going to say, hey, create me a new cookie. And it's just going to be called my cookie. And we're actually just going to attach that value on there. So again, we're going to come in here. And if we refresh this, we will see both of those cookies. But again, no SameSite has been set there. So what's going on here is you would think that, okay, the SameSite is just an attribute of cookie. How can we just go ahead and set that on the cookie? Well, if we look at the cookie, this is coming from the javax.servlet.http package. And this has been donated to the Eclipse Foundation, right? And so there isn't a lot of major development happening on this. And what's happening is because of that, there's no change made to the cookie class that we can just go ahead and be able to use that. They're not innovating on that. So as we move to Jakarta in the Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3.0, that may be a chance for us to kind of evolve on those APIs, and maybe there will be a way to kind of set that same attribute. For now, there's no way to do that. So it's really up to the individual implementations to go ahead and do that. Unfortunately, that gets a little tricky because now we have to worry about like, how does Tomcat do it? How does Jetty do it? How does Netty do it? And so we have to kind of find a solution for this. So we have a couple. One thing that we can do is we can come into our properties, and if we want to set server dot servlet dot session dot cookie same site, let's just go ahead and set it to lax. If we go ahead and restart this, and let's take a look at this. Now, if we see over here, our JSession ID is lax. Servlet session cookie, that should have set them both. Not sure why, but we're going to go ahead. This might have been from earlier, but I'm going to set my cookie a different way. But we can actually set this default here in our properties. Now, this may not be maybe we want to do this for a certain, across the board, but then there are particular cookies that we want to change. Now, again, it'd be nice if we could just come in here, and if there was an attribute that we could pass this cookie, that'd be great, but there isn't. So we do have another way to kind of go ahead and set this, and that is by using, so we can create a new bean. We can say, this is cookie same site supplier, right? And what we can do is we can return the cookie same site supplier, and this has some static methods on it. So we could say, hey, we actually want to return, we want this to be strict, and we want to be very specific when it has a name of, say, my cookie. So in this case, for that one particular cookie that I had, I'm going to go ahead and set that same site attribute to strict. So if we go ahead and stop and rerun this, you can see that we've now set this to strict, and this one is lax. So just a way to kind of handle that same site cookie attribute. Again, I'm not 100% up to date on exactly how that works. So you may want to do it just from a cookie and a browser standpoint. So you may want to go do some digging on that if you're working in that world. But that is important when you're talking about dealing with CSRF tags. Dan, in your opinion, are Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3 stable enough to use for learning Spring? So yeah, if you're not planning on putting this in production, if you're just using it, the milestones are absolutely good enough to use. And if you come across issues, that these are good opportunities to raise these up on GitHub. So yeah, I'd say if you're just learning, grab a milestone. Don't grab a snapshot. Grab a milestone, and you should be good. What is the need for cookies to be set here? Well, again, in this instance, nothing. This is arbitrary, just setting a cookie. But again, if you're dealing with third-party cookies or clicking through to another site, that's when this gets to be important. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Something else I want to look at is pluggable sanitization rules. So let's go ahead and go into edit configurations. And I'm going to change this to so all I'm doing is adding a couple command line arguments here. And they just have some, so we have vary.secret is equal to password and vary.other is equal to key. So what we're going to do is go ahead and rerun this application with those command line arguments. Yes, I am going to mention the WebTestClient. We'll try and get to that quickly. If I go to the Actuator and I go to, where is my environment? So if I look at environment, This is going to give me all the property sources. One of the property sources that we are working with is the command line args. So if you look at very.secret, the value for that is not password. It's actually a bunch of asterisks. But very.other, the value came through as key. And the reason for this is because we are doing some sanitizing of data on both the env and the config props. And the way that this works is, let's go ahead and see if we can sanitizing. Oops, that's not what I'm looking for. Sanitizer. So if we look at sanitizer, you can see that there are some default keys to sanitize. So password was one, secret was another. If we added one called token, it would sanitize that as well. But what happens if it isn't one of these keys to sanitize? Well, that's what we've added in 2.6 is a way for us to kind of write our own sanitizer. So the way that we're going to do that is, again, I'm just going to create another bean here. This is going to return the sanitizing function. And if we return new sanitizing. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Again, the sanitizing function is just a functional interface, has a single method called apply, which takes in some sanitizable data. So if you look at sanitizable data, it has the property source, the key, and the value. So this is where we can really start to key in on, hey, what if the property source is, from a command line arg? What if I want to make sure I sanitize anything coming in that off the command line arg and just sanitize that? So if it is displayed in an environment like the actuator endpoint, then nothing is actually going to get out. You could do some wildcards on a key. Maybe you have some naming conventions for keys that may hold some secret data and you don't want those to get out. So there's a whole bunch of things we can do. Again, IntelliJ is probably going to tell us, hey, you can actually turn this into a Lambda if you wanted to. But I just want to kind of walk through this and then we can kind of clean this up. So the first thing that we would want to do, and actually, let's just return that. It's going to get our data and we're going to return that. And when we get our data, we can get the property source. So in this case, I want to get the property source and I want to make sure that it's equal to the command line property source. And make sure it's equal to that. And if it is equal to that, I can say, I just want to return the value. This is top secret. And then if it's not, I just want to return the data. So this is my new sanitizing function. Again, if we look in our edit configurations, so I have a very.other key and very.dan equals Vega. If I go ahead and run this, and refresh this. Now you can see any of the other keys that didn't get picked up by the default sanitizer were now picked up by the sanitizing function that I wrote. And so the value of that is now, this is top secret, and then these kind of remain the same. So let me see where we are. Okay, we are coming up to it. I was going to talk about metrics for a bit and jump into Tanzu Wavefront, but I think I'm going to skip that just because I know one person jumped in there and said, let's talk about the WebTestClient. Why * value for very secret? So this is the one that's getting picked up by that default sanitizer. Don't know if there's a way to override that, because again, this is this is the default sanitizer. So any keys in there that were being picked up, so that one had a dot secret on it. So that's getting picked up by that. If we change that to this, oh, that still has it. Must be starting with, huh? But yeah, that's why the default sanitizer is picking that up. Okay, so I want to take a look at one more thing. So we have this post controller. Let's go ahead and add a new get mapping. So get mapping for posts, public list of strings, find all posts. Sorry, anytime somebody tries to join, it takes my mouse, takes my keyboard away. Find all posts. And if I go return, just say list.of, post 1, post 2, and post 3. Okay, so we have this endpoint that we want to test. Let's go ahead and create a new test class, and we'll test that find all method. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a web MVC test and restrict it to that post controller test. So web MVC test is a slice test made up of a bunch of other annotations, one of which will auto configure web MVC, auto configures a mock MVC for us, and imports auto configuration. So in the past, if you've had a mix of, let's say, MVC and WebFlux endpoints, or methods that you wanted to test, there was no easy way to do so. Now, in a later version of Spring, there was kind of a workaround. So you can write a before each method in here, and you can say, hey, set up a web test client for me, and bind it to kind of mock MVC to kind of, this glue to get this to work. But what people really wanted was a way that we can unify all of our tests and just use the web test client across the board. And so Spring Boot 2.6 and above brings this to us. It brings us to us in any WebFlux apps, in mock environments, or any web apps against live servers for Spring MVC. So this is basically any class annotated with auto configure mock MVC will now get an injected version instance of the web test client. So what does this mean? So this means that if we have on our class path, Spring Boot starter WebFlux. Well, I know that exists, so I'm going to ignore you. And Spring framework.boot. There we go. And if we go ahead and reload, if we come back over to our post controller, now we can get a auto-wired instance of our web test client, and we'll call this web test client. And now we can use that to go ahead and write some tests. So I may want to web test client.get. Why am I? So we're going to make a call to /posts. We're going to exchange. We're going to expect the status that is okay. We are going to expect the body. We want the JSON path, and we want the length to equal 3, because we had What did I miss there? Path. So git URI is posts exchange, status is okay. Expect, why is that? So then we're just expecting that we get 3 of those back because we created 3 in our method. So if we go ahead and run this, again, this should pass. We're getting an instance of the WebTestClient configured for us, instead of having to jump through some of the hoops that we would have had to have done before. Okay, I think like I said, I was gonna jump into one more thing, but I'm not going to. I just want to look in the release notes. So again, the release notes are broken down into, hey, if you're upgrading from 2.5, here are the things that you're going to look for. So again, circular references, our path-based pattern matching, our Actuator environment info contributor was disabled by default now. Those application startup keys that we talked about, the records and at configuration properties, we no longer need that constructor binding. And then when it comes to new stuff, we talked about same-site cookie attribute. The reactive server session properties have changed just to be on par with the servlet version. Being able to have a pluggable sanitization rule. Oh, I didn't get into this one either. So if you just change a key, if you just set a key to true, so if we set management.info.java.enabled equal to true, in that info actuator endpoint, we get a bunch of info about the version of Java that we're using. And this can be helpful in certain cloud environments where you may not have access to that. Talked about this. I didn't get into health support. The metric support is what I really wanted to look at. So we've kind of exposed some more metrics on different things like application startup and disk space. This really helps you when you're using something like Wavefront. So Tanzu observability, Wavefront, really good product. If you go to start.spring.io and pick Wavefront, you can get a freemium version, which allows you to have, it holds up to like 5 days of data, which is perfect for just kind of testing it out. With that, you can kind of create all kinds of dashboards and charts and great things. And 2 of those metrics that we've added are start and ready time. And so started is the time it took the application to start. Ready is the time that the application is ready to service requests. There's a few more things for Docker image building. Again, we looked at using WebTestClient to test Spring MVC. You can do that now. This is a really good one, message source based interpolation of bean validation messages. So that's a good one. If you're doing any type of web services, there's a new @web service server test slice. So that can be very helpful as well. We talked about all the dependency upgrades. There are a bunch of little miscellaneous ones. A couple really stand out to me. If you're using Lombok's @value, the @Spring Boot configuration processor can now generate metadata for classes annotated with Lombok's @value. Being able to, this one is pretty cool. So Jackson's default leniency can be configured using spring.jackson.default leniency property. And all this meant in the past, if you had, say, a local date time, and you tried to create some data with that, say like just a date, Jackson will go, okay, a date time, but I can accept the date. Let's go ahead and create that property. Well, if you set leniency equal to false, so I don't want you to be lenient, it will say, no, this is a date time. I don't want you to pass me a date. I want you to pass me an actual date and a time. So that's pretty cool. And then just some deprecations in Spring Boot 2.6. So a lot of cool stuff in here. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you really want to learn Spring Boot, this is kind of the first time I've dove into the release notes and really took a look at each one of these. I think it's very valuable in maybe going back and doing this for things like 2.5, 2.4, 2.3, or whatever, because you get a good indication of just where Spring Boot has come from, where it's going, and kind of the motivations behind some of the changes. So with that, I will answer any questions you have.
And if someone doesn't feel like typing, you should have the ability to unmute yourself as well if you want to just shout out.
Can you guys hear me?
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there any change
No
in
problem.
Spring? Is there any change in Spring security which will affect this with this new release?
So the two things that stand out, well, there are a couple things. So one, we've upgraded Spring Security to a new version, 5.6.2. You'd have to look in the release notes. So that's gone up. The path matching that I talked about before in the controller, that also affects Spring Security configuration. So if you are matching on something, something in the release notes, let me share my screen again and show you that. It shows an example here. So if you're in your Spring Security configuration, if you have something like hello and permit all, that grants access to hello. But again, as I mentioned, the pattern parser is much more strict. If you want to match on hello, you need the actual like /hello. It's not going to match on this. So if you upgrade and you find that Spring Security is having issues with like paths and like permissions, this may be one place to look at. And then one other thing I noticed in the kind of miscellaneous stuff is auto configuration for the user details service will now back off if there is a authentication manager provider B. So those are the three kind of Spring Security related issues that I think I saw.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.